Welcome, friends. Welcome, colleagues. Welcome, comrades. Welcome, the dear 23 people, some of whom are overseas, some of whom are joining us from their homes in Edmonton, some of whom are scattered all across the land. We're thinking of you wherever you are, and for those of you watching on Zoom, you might not be able to see, but we have a packed house of wonderful people here, and we want to particularly acknowledge that with us today, we have Svetlana and Tamara Medwidsky, the sister-in-law and niece of the late Bohdan Medwidsky. We're so grateful to have you here and for all of us to be able to stand on this land here in Treaty 6 territory, here in Amaskwachis, Waskahikan, a place where Blackfoot, Cree, Alexis Nakota Sioux, Ojibwe, traders from the Iroquois, and others made their lives and livelihoods and laid down trails that many Ukrainian Canadians came to follow as they became Canadians in this place. And we're very grateful to welcome you all here to the 2023 annual, this is the second annual Bohdan Medwidsky Memorial Lecture. With these acknowledgements, I want to let you know that the Kule Folklore Center is very grateful for all of the participation and energy and enthusiasm that's gone into this talk, including from all the volunteers at the center who we don't quite have time to name here. We're particularly grateful that we've got a special bond with other centers on this campus, including through the presence of Dr. Alexander Panikiev, who is the president of the Alberta Society for the Advancement of Ukrainian Studies, our co-sponsor here with the Kule Folklore Center for this memorial lecture. He's also the research coordinator and editor-in-chief of the Forum for Ukrainian Studies at the Contemporary Ukrainian Studies program at Canadian Institute for Ukrainian Studies at the U of A, in other words, CIUS, which is how we all know it. And I want to also acknowledge that Natalie Kononenko-Friesen is here, and our former director, Yelena Pogostan, and many other members of the community here from the Kule Folklore Center. Alexander is going to introduce you to the tradition of this lecture, to a person he knew well while he was living.
I'm also really honored to welcome you to the second annual Bohdan Medwidsky Memorial Lecture. It is surprising how everything is interconnected in this world. And folklore is always about those sometimes mysterious connections and the contexts in which those connections emerge and sometimes develop unpredictably. The link many of us in this room share is Dr. Bohdan Medwidsky. He was the mentor and a good friend to many of us. Many remember him as the exceptional scholar and devoted community leader. The connection that unites the Alberta Society for the Advancement of Ukrainian Studies I have the privilege to be the president of. And the Kule Folklore Center is also Dr. Bohdan Medwidsky. He was the founder of both organizations, so it's unsurprising that these two organizations organizing this lecture together. Last year, speaker of the inaugural memorial lecture was Dr. Robert Klimash, a good friend and colleague folklorist of Dr. Bohdan Medwidsky. They both share not only love for the Ukrainian folklore, but also very quirky sense of humor. And many of you know what I mean, this gesture also. Bohdan Medwidsky also deeply cared that all Ukrainian traditions keep living and flourishing. that Ukrainians remember their roots. Most importantly, he wanted Ukrainian folklore to be professionally studied at the University of Alberta at the professional level. So one of his main achievements that we have right now a full-fledged program in Ukrainian folklore on PhD and master's levels. This year's speaker, Dr. Andriy Nahachewsky, it's also a surprising connection, was his first PhD student who defended his dissertation under Dr. Bohdan Medwidsky's supervision. Andriy Nahachewsky also was the director of the Kule Folklore Center for almost 17 years, if I'm not mistaken. Surprising connections. I like to share this story, and I already shared this story many times. And probably you know this story. The date of this lecture is not coincidence also. It is Good Friday. When Dr. Medwidsky was just 12 years old, for the first time he witnessed a large gathering of Ukrainians celebrating Easter in the displaced person camp. It happened right after the end of Second World War II, when he finally reunited with his family after many years of separation. Because he was separated from his relatives early on, he needed to rediscover his roots, his identity, to learn Ukrainian language. It was the moment when he started wondering what it is to be Ukrainian, how it is, what kind of identity it is. Today's lecture concerns the roots of Ukrainian Canadian ethnic expressions and how they have constituted themselves at different times. Considering that Ukraine is again experiencing the hardship of war and many Ukrainians are finding a safe harbor in Canada, the theme of this lecture proves to be, again, really relevant and interconnected in many ways. Thank you.
I want to mention also that for those who are reflecting on Dr. Medwidsky's life, there will be a mass said in his honor at St. George's Ukrainian Catholic Church on this Thursday, April 20th at 7 p.m. if anybody would care to attend that. There are some other announcements, but I think we'll save them until the end to tell you about the other wonderful things you can do following this lecture, because I'm very anxious to turn, of course, to speaking about our dear lecturer here, Dr. Andriy Nahachewsky, who, as was said, was Dr. Bohdan Medwidsky's first PhD student. He got a degree, a BA cum laude, in Ukrainian studies there, and went on to the Alexander Kornichuk Institute of Culture in Kyiv in a special one-year program. He then returned to Canada, and at York University, he did a Bachelor of Fine Arts in dance. This marriage of Ukrainian studies and dance has continued throughout his academic career and, of course, in all aspects of his life. At the U of A here, he came to study Ukrainian folklore for an MA, and he worked as a researcher for the Ukrainian Cultural Heritage Village for several years. On completing his MA in Ukrainian folklore, he headed over to Great Britain to the Center for Dance Studies there for a special intensive program. He studied at the Center for Dance Studies there before returning to get his PhD here in Ukrainian folklore. Now, during the time that he was working on his PhD in Ukrainian folklore, many of the collaborative works that he began were developed. As his career continued, we find that he wrote over 30 publications that have names that'll echo in this room because many of his co-authors are here. As an intensely collaborative scholar and one who has worked very hard to ensure that the legacy Canadian-Ukrainian experience has been preserved. We find him working with curators here and colleagues who have returned to the University of Alberta to see their dear friend. We are so grateful that he's come here to us today from Brussels, where he spends a great deal of his time. The students at the center were extremely excited to see him because, of course, as he was the chair of the Kule Folklore Center for 15 years, he's made a mark on the institution. Most dear to the hearts of many of us are his work on proverbs that can be heard on the radio, proverbs that are contained in the book, Proverbs in Motion, which of course is a festschrift in honor of Bohdan Medwidsky. Andriy and Marina Chernyskevska put this together. Our speaker is also the Hutsalak Chair Emeritus and the first to occupy that position. In all of his work, Andriy has infused this love of dance and an energy that truly has kept him in motion, and he continues to move all of us with his extraordinary work. Please join me in welcoming our dear colleague and friend, Dr. Andriy Nahachewsky.
Thank you, and hello, everybody. I'm very honored and terrified to see so many of you. I want to thank the Alberta Society for the Advancement of Ukrainian Studies. Thank you also to the Kule Folklore Center, Interim Director Andy Palmer. Thank you, Lenine, for organizing this and many, many, many things, and also all the staff and the archivists and the various researchers and assistants at the Folklore Center. I want to thank Robert Klimash, the first speaker of Bohdan Medwidsky Memorial Lecture. I guess the tradition is going to be that the speaker gets to nominate next year's speaker. So that is an interesting challenge, I think. And I want to thank Bohdan Medwidsky. He was a person who was passionate about his chosen field. He was the guy that he didn't have children of his own, but he adopted people serially, usually one, maybe two at a time, and he uplifted them. He supported them, he promoted them, he did all kinds of things, and I was really lucky to be one of his adopted sons. He was, as a scholar, very interested in Ukrainian culture, obviously, Ukrainian Canadian culture in particular, and he really loved the idea of hybridity, and that's a theme and an idea I'd like to pick up and play with this afternoon. The paradigm for thinking about Ukrainian Canadian culture in general is an immigrant culture, an ethnic culture in Canada. Ukrainians are 3% or 4% of Canadian population, and they're more vocal than 3%. They're a particularly visible ethnic community. In sociology and cultural studies and folklore studies as well, the kind of the core question to look at ethnic groups is this question of preservation and or assimilation. Today, I want to smash those ideas. I want to talk about Ukrainian Canadian culture on the move. I want to talk about neither assimilation nor preservation, but many other things that happen as well as or instead of those kind of things. And the on the move part of the title of today's presentation is kind of a double pun or something like that. First, I want to speak about dance. Although usually as a scholar in Edmonton, I've spoken about material culture or actually graffiti or ritual culture, immigration stories, dance has indeed been the subject matter that's closest to my heart, that kind of got me into the business in the first place, and also what I publish most about and what I'm most active about right now. The presentation I make is going to deal with three smaller projects that are recent in my work. Dance is a fantastic subject to understand Ukrainian Canadian studies because dance is very important, disproportionately important in the Ukrainian Canadian community. Robert Klimash spoke early in the 60s about how ethnic communities, the Ukrainian Canadian community, shifted away from linguistic into culinary and physical and other manifestations, symbols of ethnicity, and dance is exactly one of those where you don't necessarily need to speak the language to do it. So it has been taken up an awful lot among younger generations, among non-speaking Ukrainians, among people that are half Ukrainian, 1/4 Ukrainian, or not Ukrainian heritage at all, but it's an ethnic symbol that's available to them, unlike other particular things. It has perhaps 10,000 people in Canada who are members of amateur folk dance groups that perform on stage. And that was true in the early 1980s, and it's probably true right now. We haven't exactly counted lately, but we think the numbers are about at the same level as they were already for 4 or 5 decades, which is absolutely amazing for an ethnic cultural phenomenon. The negative parts about dance are that it's kind of a specialized activity. To become a good, engaged person in the Ukrainian dance community takes many years of commitment and dedication, and for some people, fanaticism. They kind of become a specialized subculture of their own, and so the relationship between the larger Ukrainian Canadian community and the Ukrainian Canadian dance community, there's a boundary in there, and sometimes there are tensions in there. So often the non-dancing part of the Ukrainian dance community sees the dancers as kind of a ghetto, a place apart that engages fanatically in thousands of dollars to buy red boots, but not with the other stuff that Ukrainian Canadians should be involved in. There's a little bit of that kind of tension within the community. Another reason why dance is a bad topic to talk about today is because it's Good Friday, and we're not supposed to be dancing on Good Friday on the Julian calendar. So I apologize for that, but I would like to do this anyways. My goal is to talk about how Ukrainian Canadian culture is moving, not just physically moving, but also changing in quality all the time. And also, we need to even change the paradigm of thinking about Ukrainian Canadian culture because of all these things that are changing and moving. So the kind of older school established at the beginning of the 20th century model for how to imagine ethnic groups is there's a timeline, and you can kind of measure super Ukrainianness as 100% and zero Ukrainianness as 0%. And as immigrants come, then Canada gets a bunch of Ukrainianness into it, and then they gradually assimilate, and the line goes down. So ethnic communities for a long time were thought about like this. And I would say this model is actually still very prevalent in kind of pop culture assumptions, cliches, and stereotypes about how ethnicity works in a country like Canada. Earlier scholarship has often been, yeah, but what is the angle of that line that's descending? The cheerleaders for Ukrainian community, so let's say Ukrainian scholars looking at this question, will want and therefore see a very slow slope. Oh, Ukrainians are going to be here for generations and generations and generations. We're not going to assimilate because we're tough, and that's a good thing. And then other scholars will observe or maybe hope that, oh, let's get those ethnics melted down into normal Canadians. Let's have them assimilate as fast as possible so that the Ukrainianness thing goes down to zero. And so a lot of the history of ethnic studies scholarship in various disciplines has been kind of negotiating the angles of decline. A complication to that, of course, is waves of immigration. So 160,000 people who can be called Ukrainians now came between 1891 and 1914. According to this model, we should expect Canadianization, less Ukrainianness, and then another 75,000 came and raised the arrow on the graph a little bit, and then it went down, and then after World War II they came, and then after the fourth wave came, etc. So it's a jiggity instead of a straight triangle for us. So that complicates it. I'll argue that it doesn't complicate it enough yet. So I want to give 3 examples from recent smaller studies talking about things other than preservation, that things that disturb that model. The first example I want to talk about, repertoire, how the content of Ukrainian Canadian culture is maybe not what is expected in such an earlier model, the qualities of Ukrainian Canadian culture, and how even the whole center of gravity is not stable. So the first project I want to talk about started with in my master's thesis back in the 1980s. I was interested in the dances that the immigrants brought with them when they came between 1891 and 1914. I did a whole bunch of interviews. I didn't know this then, but after that I found out that a man called Roman Harasemchuk did kind of the same thing in Western Ukraine. And he wrote manuscripts. He went from village to village asking people, what did you dance, and described the dances. In the areas from where Ukrainian Canadians originate, he found about 70 dances in about 300 different variants, and he wrote them out. This was never published, it was just in manuscripts, so I found it way later. I tried to do the same thing. I didn't get to go to 100 villages, but for my master's thesis I went to a couple places, and I found 33 dances that clearly came before the people came across the ocean. The immigrants danced it, and sometimes the children of the immigrants, and a few of the dances lasted even longer. But at first sight, it looks like this kind of fits the triangle. The immigrants bring 33 dances, and then it becomes 31, and then it becomes 29, and then it becomes 14, and now maybe there's 3 or 4 of them that they still do. So we're going on the triangle, perhaps. Let's take a look at an example of dance. This film is from 1960. It's a homemade 8mm film of people having a house party. It doesn't have sound, I'm sorry. They're dancing a kolomeyka here. 5 or 6 of them holding shoulders, holding behind their backs and spinning around. The older guy is once in a while, you can see his shoulders and his head move a little bit differently because he's doing something fancy with his feet, but we can't see. And everybody's laughing. These are 2 younger men who actually took Ukrainian dancing lessons, so ignore those 5 seconds. But now we're back to more regular Ukrainian Canadian dancing in the 1960s, and they're dancing a polka. I researched this for 30 years and didn't know that my mom had this video in her house. That's my dido. There he goes. He's doing this a little bit, and they're laughing. So he's doing it as a little bit of a showing off thing. You can see them glancing at the camera quite often. So they're a little bit self-conscious, and he's fooling around. He's doing a little bit of extra expression that he wouldn't necessarily do. So of those 33 dances, there were 8 of them that I could see from the old country sources that were kind of long-standing, established Ukrainian dances that people would call Ukrainian dances from that part of Western Ukraine. Kolomeyka is one that many people would be familiar with. It has many lives in many different contexts. But many of the other ones are actually not so familiar to Canadians. Not very many Canadians would know Kapirush, for example. But my grandmother's generation knew and remembered that dance. Arkan was also fair. It became more popular in the national thing, so we hear about it. But Vasalecha, these dances are not so common, even though in the literature I can document that they were quite widespread in that area. So very interesting results is that about a quarter of them were common, long-standing Ukrainian dancing, and 3/4 of them are somehow not quite what you would expect, not quite what I would expect at first. 4 of them were common, but newly diffused into Halachina, like the polka, for example. People wouldn't particularly call that a Ukrainian dance, but that's a dance that the immigrants knew and brought over with them. And many other ones like that. 6 of them were very rare. When Harasemchuk went to several hundred villages, he said, oh, in 2 villages they know this strange little thing. And then the Canadians remembered that strange little thing a whole bunch, way disproportionately more than they should have. 8 of them were undocumented by Harasemchuk. After all, he couldn't go to every village, but they look old country to me. Some of them have just different names, but the form seems familiar. And one of them was never there, but it was invented in Canada. That's the kolomeyka. I won't spend a lot of time going on the details of them, but polka, schnellpolka, sidemka, or Schiebenschritt, it has a German name too, the waltz. Some of the Canadian people said, yeah, we knew the waltz in Europe before we came, and other people said, no, we learned the waltz in Canada. And of course, they learned many other dances in Canada too. Right away in some communities, they learned square dancing. The schottische was really popular. By World War I, the 2-step was very popular. And when I did my research, a lot of my interviewees told me that schottische was an old Ukrainian dance. But it wasn't. It was an old-time dance. These dances converted themselves into old-time dances for the younger generations, and then only later, dance like the new Kolomeyka became an ethnic symbol. The butterfly is called butterfly. That's not a Ukrainian name. But actually, it came under another name by the immigrants at the time, and people didn't have a clue that that was a Ukrainian dance, but they thought it was an old-time dance. So the dances are really not stable. They're not what would be expected by the national movement, and the repertoire changed an awful lot. Here, just to show you that I actually know what their names are, that I did this homework. I did get my master's thesis. I go to kind of the third or the fourth point that's a little bit new yet. So some of the old country repertoire was retained. Some of it was abandoned pretty quickly. Some of it was adapted to the new situation. They created other ones. And when I went to Brazil, I found out that they also invented old Ukrainian dances there too. And interestingly, the two dances that changed the most were the two dances that lasted the longest. We're not talking preservation here. We're talking about creative adaptation that makes sense in the new environment. And the Kolomeyka as a super strong ethnic symbol, and the butterfly as not that at all, but it did last the longest. That's the first example that I have showing that this idea of preservation is not the key word that we should hang on to when we're trying to understand Ukrainian Canadian culture through dance. The second point I want to make is how the quality of the dancing changed as well. And there are several different eras of Ukrainian dance in Canada that are really strong shifts, and I want to describe them briefly to you right now. The one shift is from social dancing to national dancing. It's not really a replacement, but it's an addition, an additional layer. A new context for dancing was introduced into the Ukrainian Canadian communities, and that was national dancing. I tried really hard to find two pictures, one from a social dance situation and one from a stage dance situation, where it looks like it's the same thing. It's four people holding hands behind their back, turning in a circle. They're doing that in both. But it's really hard to find examples like that. The forms of the dancing on stage often are completely different than the forms of the dances that these young adults and whoever was dancing knew from before the stage tradition. So when they introduced the stage tradition, they introduced something completely foreign that they called not foreign. They called it, oh, this is the real Ukrainian dancing, even though it was something those people had never seen before. And they responded by going, okay, and they accepted it. For the first time, the dance has become symbolically ethnic. Whereas over here, you're dancing to have fun at a house party, to celebrate somebody's wedding or something like that. Here you're dancing because it's a symbol of Ukrainianness. That's a very different function for this activity that you're doing. The repertoire here changed all the time, as I think I've described in a little while. The repertoire here in this epoch of Ukrainian stage dancing was fixed. There were about 10 dances, maybe a dozen dances, and they did them from Nanaimo, BC to Sydney, Nova Scotia, and they did them in Canada, in the United States, in Argentina, Brazil, Australia, wherever Avraменko and his students went. They taught the same repertoire, and they taught the repertoire must never change, and we have documents of it quite stable, actually. When these people are dancing, they're on the stage, they're specially trained, they had rehearsals, unlike any of these people, and the repertoire was changed. I said that already. Another thing that makes this kind of dancing different is these people are wearing their clothes, and these people are wearing costumes to make them somebody else. They're wearing, in this case, costumes to make themselves villagers. The back of the stage got a mountain and a fir tree painted so that there's an imputed setting of we are over there for this moment. And the audience is supposed to travel with the dancers to this imputed setting, I call it technically, to this imaginary land of Ukraine in the past, romanticized, idealized in many different ways. And the dances themselves were way more complicated. Here, the dance consists of spin one way, slow down, spin the other way, rest if you're tired, spin one way, spin the other way. That's really at 2 figures or even 1 figure. And here they had to memorize 10 figures and formations and stuff like that. So you couldn't just improvise that stuff. You had to learn how to do it. The beginning of the division of dancer versus non-dancer. I will show you a hopak from that time. This is from 1931, Metropolitan Opera House in New York City, the biggest Ukrainian dance concert and performance ever in North America up to that time, till 1931. This is the hopak that was danced there. We have on film about 9 dances that they performed. And those of you that know Ukrainian dancing know that that's not what a hopak looks like nowadays. Nowadays, hopak is a super big, spectacular, acrobatic, virtuosic, colorful dance that is done always at the end of the concert, because once you do a hopak, what can you do after that? But here it was in the middle of the concert because they had a whole bunch of other stuff to do, and it's not so big and fancy. This wasn't in Canada, but half of these performers are Canadian. They traveled from Hamilton and Toronto to New York City for the show. It was a sold-out audience, partly like today, because everybody's mom and dad and Baba and Yuda had to come. But it was spectacular and stupendous for its time. Vasily Avraменко was the leader at this time, and the shift after that was more, instead of national identity and quantity and just sort of being impressive, the shift after that became to make theater art. And that's kind of the next generation that happens. So complicated enough that you had to practice, complicated enough that it was really difficult to bring 500 people from 20 different places and have one rehearsal and have them do it nicely. But it was about monumentality. It was about big impression. And if this would be in color, you'd also see very colorful, etc. Extra guys in the back. We still have that national thing of pretending you're in a village with the backdrop and with the music and the costumes. All of those things reinforced the national quality away back in the homeland. We wish we were there kind of idea. The next shift happened maybe 1958. Well, even after World War II, we started getting a few new dance teachers who came from Europe being theater dancers and being Ukrainian, and the community really wanted dancing, but Avraменко couldn't be in 200 places at once. So there was a huge love for that stage dancing, and not enough qualified teachers or even unqualified teachers who would agree to stand up and teach the 10 figures to the dancers. So there was a vacuum of artistry and leadership, and especially from 58 to 62, we had the thaw in the Cold War. Different staged folk dance professional ensembles came from the Soviet Union as part of the Cold War. And half of the Ukrainians boycotted these communists, giving communist propaganda, and the other half of the Ukrainians snuck in to see the theater because it was really good dancing. So groups like Moiseyev's ensemble, the Red Army, the Red Navy, came to Canada, to North America, sometimes right to Edmonton, and a lot of Ukrainians saw this, and it blew their minds, and it changed their idea of what Ukrainian dance is, and it made it a beautiful, exciting North American thing to do. No longer for mostly the Ukrainian audience so that we could reinforce our own self-identity, but now it was for the whole world to see that Ukrainian dance had beautiful art, and it deserves to be honored, it deserves to be respected, and it deserves to be its own country. That's the way the Canadian Ukrainians spun that kind of thing. And the dancing itself changed an awful lot in form. The colors became more spectacular. Certainly the physical movement became much more spectacular. It needed more rehearsals and more rehearsals. So if you could do this dance after maybe 3 rehearsals, you needed 100 rehearsals to do this kind of dancing. So this is the time in the 1960s of the formation of permanent groups where they would rehearse all year round and then do a performance whenever they had a gig. As opposed to these people who would have a gig and then say, okay, can you come? Let's do it next Sunday at the Mother's Day concert, kind of thing. Repertoire changed completely again. This was the time of the introduction of many regions of Ukraine. Ukraine is a big country, so there are ethnographic regions. They have different costumes, they have different dances, and that became part of the theatrical diversity that made this an attractive art form, so said the community people. This is a 1-minute promotion video made by the Voya dancers of Edmonton, and I think it's a good example. If you don't know the post-1960s staged Ukrainian dance, in 60 seconds you get to see a whole bunch of it. you get a taste of it. And the dance group is 30 years ago, but the name Volya right now just resonates really, really strongly. And they're really happy. It means freedom right now. It meant freedom before too, but. So it shifted from national dancing to spectacular dancing, and that's a whole different paradigm and a whole different kind of activity. And then there's another shift. It didn't really happen in Canada. Maybe it didn't happen in Canada yet. We'll see. I want to mention it because it can kind of influence our thinking. After the Soviet Union fell, these big institutional professional dance ensembles mostly fell as well. They were hugely subsidized by the Soviet government, by Soviet Ukrainian government, and the Soviet Ukrainian government still subsidizes a few of them, but if there were maybe 10% of them survived the 1990s and the huge inflation and independence and shift to the market economy, etc. Many of those dancers just stopped their career and started a new career. And of course, there were literally 100,000, hundreds of thousands of amateur dancers as well. In Ukraine, a big movement has been to go to a back to the roots. Instead of this kind of dancing, which fits really nicely, it grew in socialist realism, and it was quite compatible with socialist realism, but the Canadians turned it a little bit national-ish compared to the Soviets. So the Ukrainians for a long time made sure certain steps don't go in the Hopak because that's a Russian step. But in the Soviet Union, of course, that wouldn't have been a boundary. But in Canada, the police force that, no, that step's not acceptable, that step's Russian. Putting your hands like this is Ukrainian, putting your hands like this is Russian. Pointing your toe is Ukrainian, you can't see my pointed toe. But flexing your toe is Russian. We had all kinds of rules. They weren't real ethnographic rules, they were invented rules because we needed boundaries. In Soviet Ukraine, those boundaries were way different if they existed at all. And then in the 1990s, a whole bunch of their teachers came to Canada and basically took over every senior dance group in Canada and did it their way where the boundaries weren't there. So the generation of people my age were shocked. Oh my God, they're doing that and it's wrong. But they won and everybody does it now. And they control basically every single senior Ukrainian dance group across the country. And half of the children's groups. There are about 230 of them, 250 in some counts, maybe 270 even in some counts. And in Ukraine, there was kind of a revolution against that. We stopped doing the big, spectacular Moiseyev-style dancing, and we go back to the roots. Let's find out what our grandmothers and grandfathers danced, and let's reconstruct that. Because all that stage stuff is not authentic. We want to be authentic. And there was a big movement in singing like that. There was a big movement in dance like that. This isn't in Canada. There are 6 or 7 people in Canada who are wanting and trying to engage this. But in Canada, it hasn't really caught on. Some people joke that Canada has socialist realism more healthy than Ukraine does right now. But just to give you a feeling, this is a summer folk festival called Geneva in just outside of Kyiv. And one of the groups that's really activist in this thing is a group called Bohdan, and they also have lots of things online how to do it. So they take a very simple dance that has maybe 2 figures, and it's a participatory situation where you do it for yourself. This kind of dancing is quite invisible if you're looking the headlines at the big theaters. This is really grassroots down thing. It's not famous for outsiders, it's intimate for us insiders kind of dancing. So thanks, Claire. Can you shut it? There is a little bit of that in Canada, but not too much. So if the national thing existed in Ukraine, that's blue, it existed in Canada with a time shift. Avraменко was here in Ukraine, and then he went to Canada, and then he continued, and his students and his students of his students. The blue is time shifted compared to what happened in Ukraine. The red is the spectacular dancing, and that's also time shifted. It was well established in a really hot moment in the 1930s, and continued on and still continues on in Ukraine. But in Canada, it came like 3 decades later by the time it was not new anymore. Vyrsky's Hopak, probably the most famous Ukrainian stage dance choreography, was choreographed in the 1950s over here, but we saw it for the first time over here, and we copied it maybe the first time over here. We're really late with many of those things, including this time period just before the purges in the 1930s in Ukraine was a really internationalist, cosmopolitan thing. Modernist stuff, constructionist theater was happening, all kinds of avant-garde things were there, and they influenced Vyrsky, and then most of those people got silenced in one way or another. And then in the 1950s, after Stalin died, he could safely choreograph modernist constructivist themes into his staged folk dance. So the women dancers become a loom, the famous dance, if some of you know the repertoire, Rukudilnici, where the women become a loom. It's a modernist thing that they snuck into socialist realism. We're just out of sync. So in this period in the 30s, which was really important for Canada, we weren't in sync with them. In this period, we weren't in sync with them. Here, this period, no. Here we're more because more and more communication happens, but we're still not in sync. The Back to the Roots revival is proportionally bigger in Ukraine than it is in Canada, and here it's kind of not catching on all that well. Maybe it will in the future. We'll see. That's my second thing to talk about. The quality of dancing is also really on the move. And the third point is the center of gravity of Ukrainian dancing is also unstable. The center of gravity has always been unstable under the social dance repertoire. It changed right in the first summer or season of dancing time. In an ethnic minority situation, dances become a little bit more ethnic because they remind you of home, and only the Ukrainians in such and such a community do it. The Norwegians don't do it. So, oh, that must be a Ukrainian dance. So it has some kind of element of ethnic symbolism immediately because it's in a diaspora situation. But generally speaking, even though with a delay we've been inspired by Ukraine, the center of gravity of Ukrainian dance has always been to present an imaginary Ukraine. It's always been Ukraine-centered in terms of its content and its subject. Lasya Pritz, I thought, expressed that really clearly. But there were some exceptions. The first that I have heard of is a dance suite that was choreographed by a professional modern dancer, Nadia Pavlichenko in Saskatoon, called the Ukrainian Pioneer, a choreographic offering. It was the set and scenery were done by Vadim Dobrulij, a very famous artist who came. I think 1966 was the first time where on purpose the stage dancing said, we are in Canada, actually. Canadian Kolomeyka in 72 and just a few other choreographies. The Canadian Kaleidoscope by Serhiy Korolyuk, that's another Saskatoon example, choreographed in 2003. He was a recent immigrant from Ukraine and just loves Canada and wanted to make a choreography that is about here and now, and choreographed a thank you in his Ukrainian dance. Instead of different regions of Ukraine, he had Scottish Canadians and Irish Canadians and Indigenous Canadians and a few others as well. And so he had a moment where he had Indigenous dancers teaching his Ukrainian dancers how to do some powwow moves, and he got them to give him the regalia, sold, I guess, and bless this choreography that we are sharing and celebrating the kaleidoscope of Canadian things. I'll tell you what happened to that choreography a little bit later. But the example I want to talk about is a more recent one. It's a 2018 project by the Ukrainian Shumka dancers and Running Thunder dancers. And the first year they also had Kehewan Native Dance Theatre. It was done on Treaty 6 territory here in the Jubilee Auditorium, not so far away. 2 artistic directors, one Barry Belinsky with a nice Ukrainian name, who is the indigenous specialist, and Joseph Hoffman with a nice non-Ukrainian name, who is the Ukrainian choreographer for this piece. And they both said similar things. I'll let you hear them say it.
Anything where 2 cultures come together and deal with topics that are really sensitive to them, you know, you have to be very, very respectful and very collaborative. Working with my counterpart, the other co-director, Barry Belinsky, he's been working on bringing the indigenous stories. And, you know, it took a lot of effort at first to get past the point of just sort of tiptoeing around sensitivities. You know, we had to really break past that.
And we realized that we were not only talking about the relationship between these 2 communities, well, these multiple communities, but actually building the relationship between these multiple communities, and that was going to take more groundwork. So I mean, Joe went out to powwows and round dances and started to engage in that. I went to a Ukrainian festival in Dauphin and started to understand a little bit more about what this Ukrainian dance whole culture is, and we really tried to walk a couple miles in each other's shoes before we got back into it.
For me, I've been waiting for an opportunity like this for many years, ever since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came about. So for me, it's a great honor, it's a great privilege to move forward and to rebuild a new relationship, because we can't repair that old relationship. That old relationship is too damaged. So that's the whole, for me, that's why I'm doing what I'm doing with Shumka, is that breaking barriers, you know, destroying stereotypes, and, you know, building something new and exciting that, you know, the rest of Canada can say, yeah, if they can do it, why can't we? Why can't we hold hands with one another and learn from one another and celebrate with one another?
Right from the beginning, as we were talking about what kind of content could actually end up in this show, I figured, you know, this story has to be, it's distinctly a Canadian-Ukrainian story.
I think it's something I've overheard Shumka folks talking about over the months that I've been involved too, and I find that fascinating. The realization within the company that Ukrainian Shumka dance is Canadian. It's not Ukrainian. You go to Ukraine and you're very distinctly Canadian, and I would say, okay, there you go, that's it, that's the land. It's because you're here in this land. And you're here in this land that has, before you came along, grown up these people who have these ways of being, and those interactions between those people have impacted what Ukrainian identity means in Canada, and Ukrainians have impacted what Indigenous identity means in Canada.
My hope for this show is that, you know, I talk a lot about the connection and understanding that we've brought together. 2 communities coming together to create more than just a production, more than just a dance piece, more than just a story. It's in efforts to really come together and understand each other at a new level. And that's something that we're trying to implement in as real of a way as possible into what goes onto the stage, so that everybody who comes and sees this show, every audience member can leave with a new understanding of what it means to be Ukrainian, what it means to be Indigenous on this land.
I hope that people start to question themselves, their assumptions on all sides. I know I have. And to get people to not just glorify each other, not just revere the culture and say how beautiful it is, but to really look at the people and understand one another, so that we can start to take on these real issues.
We're breaking ground here. This is cutting edge collaboration with 2 different unique cultures. We're making history here. And I think that's the beautiful part of this whole collaboration, is that we're going to be in the history books as 2 entities coming together and making something really beautiful.
What a project, holy cow. There are several good reasons why a Ukrainian dance group and Indigenous dance group in Edmonton might want to do that. There are several things about these 2 particular communities that make them similar. Both of them are really large communities, especially in Western Canada. Both of them feel colonized in different ways, for sure. Both of them are minorities, and both of them are actively on the rise right now. Both use dance successfully as a powerful representational medium. So the Indigenous community has amazing dancing and lots of it. And it's more and more effective going out to the general population of settlers. In both cases, the stage dance has become really spectacular, and it's changed a lot over the 20th and 21st centuries. Ukrainian dance, I think I've just demonstrated with you, and Indigenous dance, I would argue, has changed a lot too. And both of them have extremely excellent activists right now. And then the Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommendations from 2015 were also a motivating force for this kind of a project. On the negative side, Indigenous-settler relations are often distant or conflicted. They have different situations where they're used to dancing. So powwows are not a stage the same way Ukrainian dancing is done on a stage, etc. And the Indigenous communities have a variety of different contexts, and Ukrainian communities have a variety of different contexts, but they're not the same ones. Identity messages about marginalization are no good. Ukrainians are, after all, part of the settler communities, part of the colonizers. And audiences have an assumption of authenticity. They assume uniqueness and purity and timelessness. So audience members are not told that Ukrainian dance is changing and changing and changing. Audience are told, this is traditional Ukrainian dance because that's what sells tickets really good. Kind of the popular culture language about all this stuff is traditional, authentic, blah, 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 but it's from an ethnographer's point of view not true. What do they do on stage? And this is something that I have a draft of an article in. I haven't had enough guts to publish it and haven't found the right place. But there are several things that can be done if an Indigenous and a Ukrainian community want to dance somehow. One, they could just coexist. At Heritage Festival in Howrelac Park or wherever it is, they can be on maybe the same stage, but these guys are on Tuesday afternoon and these guys are on Thursday, and so they coexist and the same audience might see them, but they don't really engage with each other. Juxtapositioning is when they actively go next to each other, and actually that has happened several times before. Cheremosh, a big Ukrainian dance group from Edmonton, had a tour to China where they co-traveled with an Indigenous dance group, but they specifically actively decided not to do any moments where they're both on stage together, maybe the bow or something like that, but they didn't mess with each other's choreography at all. Integrating would be another level of engagement, and that would be where they're both on stage at the same time, maybe one of them dancing in the other's dance, or the other one dancing in the first group's dance, or maybe they're each doing something actually together. Maybe the costumes melt, maybe the musics melt. In the Shumka production, the music actually integrated really quite well, and the dancing integrated during the hopak and during a few other moments, but really cautiously. What they did do is they displaced. They got good Ukrainian dancers who are good modern dancers, and Indigenous dancers, at least the main character, was a really good trained modern dancer. And so they displaced their movement into a neutral territory modern dance, and they communicated much of their story outside of each of their ethnic symbolic thing, but the pantomime story had content that led the story and represented things. So they displaced into a third neutral territory because that's a safe thing to do. A fourth thing they could have done, or fifth, is fusing. There are many dance projects all around the world where Bahat, the famous Indian classical dancing, joins with ballet, and they do Indian ballet fusion dance where the rhythms are shared in between, and the ballet dancers do the same rhythm on point shoes, and the Indian dancers do various movements with extended ballet arms, and they really fuse the movement, and they try to listen for common themes. And in Shumka and Running Thunder, they just literally didn't do that. The closest they did was a little bit in the hopak, where the Indigenous guys came in and did a couple of the solo steps. They did their own Indigenous things that kind of looked a little bit like a Ukrainian dancing step. And the audience went wild that the hopak has Indigenous dancers with their amazing costumes and amazing, very physical, active moving. Their real connection was when they displaced into a third, safer territory. So they used pantomime to tell the stories, or they used modern dance. Anne-Marie Sewell, who was speaking during the thing, emphasized, okay, that's it. That's the land. It's because you are in this land. It's changing the center of gravity of the Ukrainian identity of those people. It's no longer in Ukraine like 90% of all Ukrainian dances have been. So instead of doing this kind of a thing, I think that's where we're at. Change in repertoire, maybe we can represent that with the multiple colors. Changing in quality shifts it even stronger. The rise in quantitative measurement of how much Ukrainian dancing is also all over the map. It's not like the triangle. And then there's another huge, huge factor that we can't not look at. We had 3-4 waves now. As of today, the official Canadian website for people coming from Ukraine since the war started, 988,000 have applied. Canada has approved already 2/3 of a million of them. Only 146,000 have come, but that already makes it as big as this, and the war's not over. This is an enormous community that is going to absolutely change the population of people who identify with that word Ukrainian. It's also not complicated enough if we just make another red arrow, because the kind of Ukrainianness they have is very, very different. There was a big culture gap when the second wave looked at the first wave and said, oh, you guys are weird Ukrainians. And then after World War II, the people from the displaced people's camps, it was the DPs versus the Banyake. It was a huge cultural gap there. And then the fourth wave, which came from the 80s and the 90s, some people say that's the fourth wave and the fifth wave, also had a very different cultural repertoire of being Ukrainian, a very different way of conceiving it. Stories that have come in the last 13, 14 months of people coming to Canada from Ukraine, we're not allowed to call them refugees, but they're certainly displaced people, their perception of Ukrainianness is very different. In the context of this paper, the way they dance is very different. What has been done in Canada is not going to be normal for what's going to become a huge percentage of the population. In terms of kind of ethnographic theory, back in 1994, James Clifford, who is a pretty famous cultural theory guy, he talked about diasporas used to be, once you're a diaspora, you're like far. You're isolated, you're insulated, so it's like transplanting a tree 100 miles away and then it just never interacts with the old tree again. It maybe puts down roots. That was the metaphor that was most common. They were isolated. So diaspora communities were like kind of science projects of a subpopulation growing up independently. But that has never been true, and it is super not true right now when people coming have cell phones. When the rest of this Clifford quote is, can you imagine people now have cassettes and they could send audio messages across the ocean? Well, that's ancient too, and he was radical for what most Ukrainian Canadian scholars have been the paradigms that people use, not only the scholars, but more importantly, the general population. The cliche of this triangle is just not relevant anymore. We have to think of new ways. The terminology that is used when talking about this stuff has to change too. Words like emigrant, emigre, refugee are words that are old country centered and think that the old country is normal and the new country is abnormal situation. And then words like diaspora, maybe that's in between, but migrant, foreigner, transplant, that's where the new country is the norm, and then the old country is what's diverse and varied and unusual about that minority population. A little bit more modern terminology. Diaspora could be kind of more modern. Clifford was actually critiquing it in 1994. But transnational became really trendy for a while. But even transnational emphasizes the national part of it. It emphasizes, let's say, the Avraменko second layer, but doesn't really give credit to the first layer or the third or the fourth. Buy local. Actually, these people are multi-local. It's not a roots anymore. It's a rhizome, like has been the common word now for the last decade, but it's not common and normal in, let's say, the Ukrainian Canadian community or in general media thinking about these things. The media and the Ukrainian community, with our romantic hope that Ukraine stays forever, tends to keep us back in those two old blocks. But the reality is it's really messy. And on that messy ending, I would like to stop. Thank you very much.
It's really fascinating to hear all of these perspectives of Ukrainianness and how we actually perceive the notion of Ukrainianness. Because I remember myself growing in 90s in Ukraine, and we danced lambada. I don't know if you know this dance. So it was something really weird moves, and usually it is associated with some leisure on Black Sea, in my case. But when you actually showed the Volia dancing. So it reminded me when I was introduced to Ukrainian Canadian dance style here. I was invited to Malanka first time, and those people, they were not in costumes. And they invited me to dance. And I realized that they are dancing something really crazy. I cannot even follow. And I felt actually ashamed that my Ukrainianness actually went down to really down. So my question is, how actually this negotiation will be happening right now? Because we see that the number of Ukrainians that are arriving right now in Canada is huger even the first wave. We think about the Ukrainian community in plural, always in like communities. I think that this wave of immigration will create a separate, like completely different actually community that will be probably associated right now with Ukrainianness, what we have. What are your thoughts about this?
I think it's true. I think even the fourth and fifth waves, never mind the sixth one. And the sixth one is a tsunami. It will change so much if it chooses to engage with the Ukrainian Canadian established community. It may well choose just to go parallel and to kind of two solitudes. An ethnographer's job is not to say it's good or bad, but a community person's job might be, so if the existing Ukrainian Canadian community wants to engage those people, have them feel like they are us, we are them, then we have to reach out. We have to be more open-minded than we have kind of been necessarily, and we have to do a variety of things to be worthy of their attention. I think it'll revolutionize Ukrainian Canadian dance for sure.
Hi, this is from Zoom. The question is, the Indigenous dancers often wear the hokum with their regalia. Can you speak to the relation of that to Ukrainian settlers in Western Canada?
The history of Ukrainian headgear is also large and complex. Until 19th century ethnography was really active, they wore largely namitka. Married women would cover their heads always in public. This would be home-woven, large things to wrap their head in. Then there was, in the 19th century, a shift to kerchiefs, and some of them were home-woven, and this was also the shift to manufactured fabrics, and so manufactured fabrics came in. So the colored floral kerchiefs were among the new things that Ukrainian women brought to Canada in the first wave of migration. They became and stayed a symbol of that. In the middle of the 20th century, it was really common and normal for people in Canada to send them to Ukraine because they were easier to buy here. They're made in Japan. They were largely made in Japan. Good quality ones, less quality ones, etc., etc. But they became an ethnic symbol of Ukrainians, and in Ukraine as well, and in the indigenous community. I don't know the specifics of when they started sharing, but did they share as an ethnic symbol? I think no. I think they shared in the earlier layer of kind of pre-ethnic useful headgear. And then it became an ethnic symbol more and more for both communities quite separately. And now that there is a greater engagement between, let's say, Ukrainians as a settler community and the indigenous communities, they're noticing and paying more attention, and it's becoming a symbol of connection, which is kind of a complicated history that goes like this, full of changes.
Do you anticipate that Ukrainian dancing is going to follow the same trajectory as pierogies on the prairies, meaning mainstreamization of that experience that will allow non-ethnic participants joining the dancing community? It's happening. I'd like to hear your opinion on proportionally what we're talking about, how many non-Ukrainian dancers we might have in a community, and is there a future route towards that, mainstreamization of the dance?
In terms of non-Ukrainian participation in Ukrainian dance in Canada, that's been ongoing for a long, long time. If there are 1.4 million Ukrainian Canadians in Canada, that's a statistic made from the census. More than half of those are multiple ancestry people, so more than half of them are half Ukrainian or a quarter Ukrainian or something like that. So of the 10,000 people that are engaged in Ukrainian dance groups in Canada, if it was just random, half of those would be only partially Ukrainian and therefore partially non-Ukrainian already. I think it was Denis Hlinka said, if intermarriage continues in Canada the way it goes, pretty soon every Canadian is going to be partly Ukrainian. When Shumka was first founded in 1959 or 60, they had non-Ukrainian members there too, and they had a debate, and some people wanted to kick them out, but the dancers themselves made it that these people could stay dancing. Every major dance group in Canada has non-Ukrainian people. Now, some of them, like super ballet people or super modern dance people or a variety of different techniques, want to expand. If you're in Smoky Lake, Alberta, you have a 9-year-old daughter who likes to move, your options are piano lessons, maybe a jazz class, and Ukrainian dancing. Lots and lots of people are sending to Ukrainian dance classes, not because of ethnicity, but because of the kind of dance that it is. In Brazil, I think the number is more than 50% of the members of the 25 or so Ukrainian dance groups in Brazil are non-Ukrainian by heritage. And I think that will become more and more normal. Who knows what's going to happen if that back to the roots kind of Ukrainian dancing normalizes and becomes more popularized. There too, it might turn like Hungarian Tanzhaus or English country dance, where it's not about your heritage at all. It's about, this is a great community to be part of today.
In the slide that you showed about the positive side, and then the next one, the negative side of the collaboration between Shumka indigenous dance that I saw, I thought there was one element missing why you would do that, or the success of it, and that is that a project like that is perfectly grantable. I mean, if any of us here write a grant and we write this kind of thing in it, we're going to get the grant. So, and that brings me also to politics and cultural politics. I'm immediately thinking then of sort of Canada's official multicultural politics. And I'm wondering if you see in your observation a particular impact of that politics, particularly on how dance then is foregrounded, used. We see dance is in many of these communities very, very important. We have a student here who does a PhD on how Ghanaian dance sits in Alberta, of all places. I'm curious about that, about the actual cultural politics side of things.
I haven't thought about that and studied it deeply, so my answer is kind of personal, improvised intuition rather than scholarship. But I think it's very true. I think when Canada declared multiculturalism, the dance groups of all the ethnic groups were the primary beneficiaries because they're really cool public symbols. So the multiculturalism never had real money, never had money, a fraction of what quote, quote, arts were, and the Canada Council for the Arts was excluded ethnic things, but they would give $400 for a show, $400 for microphones or red boots or something. And the same to Scottish and Irish and Trinidadian and that kind of stuff. And that was the level where multiculturalism, it didn't really impact these dance groups. It didn't really create these dance groups. What it did do is give public acknowledgement and public support. Not financial support, not anything, not even legal support or anything like that, but kind of moral support. And in many ways, that's what multiculturalism was. It didn't grow to a deeper, engaged support of multiculturalism. Some, yes, of course, schools and all this kind of stuff. But the argument that it was primarily to have fancy window dressing when the Queen comes and to get more votes for the Liberal Party, that's not untrue, I think. I hope it was more than that. And then the backlash against it was the same kind of thing, I think. The funding opportunities and the gaining more market, so there were all kinds of the indigenous people had a whole new audience that they would never have had. The Ukrainians had a whole new audience that they would never have had. Good for ticket sales.
My question is to do with what we sometimes call the post-February 24th world. You've mentioned several things about, for instance, the sixth wave, the tsunami, and you also made an interesting point about the Ukrainian community, even though it's only 2.4% or whatever it is, 3%, they're a vocal community. There was a time I remember in the 90s attending a lecture like this, and the whole theme of the lecture was, will there be a Ukrainian community 20 years going forward? Or will it be like the German community where it's kind of assimilated? I guess that lecture didn't age well. What is your prognosis now in view of the post-February 24th world? And yes, there's a lot of population-wise coming in, but it's not just that. Ukraine is also getting a lot of media attention. A lot of Ukrainian Canadians are actually realizing their inner Ukrainianness, or whatever the right word for it is. Where do you see the Ukrainian community in light of the recent events going forward?
I don't have the foggiest notion. I think several things could happen. Alexander said it really beautifully about how this new tsunami is really Ukraine-centered at this point. The post-World War II people were really Ukraine-centered at this point and terrified and frustrated, and they lost. Well, the current war is not lost at this point, and so there's not that frustration and pessimism and all that kind of stuff. If Ukraine does well in the war, in 2 years, 20 years from now, Ukraine could be a fantastic, rich, thriving, wonderful place. I think many of these people will go there. They have skills for there better than they have skills for here at this point. Although the years that it takes for things to settle down, they will become bicultural in a new way. They're already probably multilingual and have all kinds of great skills of various kinds, and they're going to continue learning in Canada or in Belgium or in Poland, wherever they are. If they stay, they will become a new, different voice in the diaspora, making the West even more conscious that Ukraine is actually a people and a country. If they go back, Ukraine is going to thrive like crazy again. So there are several silver linings that are possible in the future. What about Ukrainian Canadian culture? I think it continues to be unstable. It could well be, let's call it the sixth wave, will just stay aside and it won't change very much. Like it's changing St. Martin's School and many other places like crazy right now, but that could be just a temporary thing, and then it goes back to, do we have enough kids for kindergarten for next year, kind of a thing. Or the other option is that we can get together, we can make ourselves attractive enough to that they decide to become part of this and call themselves Ukrainian Canadians in the same way. Holy moly, we don't know what's going to happen. Whether Ukrainian dancing will continue to be part of that symbolic baggage that is relevant. It could be not, but it could become. Or Easter eggs, or the language, or every single genre, every single vehicle for expression will have its own trajectory. The lines don't have to be the same for all genres. It could be Korovai making grows like crazy, but Ukrainian dancing dies. We don't know.
Several years ago, I had a chance to tag along with you, and you went to interview Chester Coutts. And I remember you asking him to talk about the beginning of Shumka, the very first formal, spectacular stage concert that his father put out $500 to rent the Jubilee Auditorium, motivated because the French had ballet on that stage, and he wanted to raise the status of Ukrainian dance to be on that stage as well. Do you think his father, Chester's father, how would he respond now to what has happened in the last 50-odd years since then?
He would lean over to Bohdan Medwidsky and say, "Bachish, я сказал," which means, I told you so. Yeah, I think he would be surprised. He would have been a member of the national ideological layer with thinking that if he promoted it to a more spectacular layer, if he made that shift, the national would stay just as strong. He would be largely satisfied with that, although I think he would think that many of the things that happened after Chester's generation were, oh my God, terrible. The way it went spectacular, the way it merged with Cats and all kinds of Hollywood shows and things like that, the way it became acrobatic, maybe his aesthetics wouldn't go for that. He would be really satisfied that there are still 10,000 Ukrainian dancers in Canada, which was definitely not guaranteed for looking in 1959 perspective.
We have a question here from Zoom. This is from Ihor. I came to Ukrainian dance late as an adult, dancing in my 50s with Vatra, an adult dance group. When we partied with the mother group Bohdan, I was gobsmacked by the, quote, Ukrainianness of these young dancers, the majority of whom knew little of the language and may not have participated in traditional Ukrainian church communities, yet their games were Ukrainian, just without the language. Even without language and the Ukrainian community lives, they fiercely identified themselves as Ukrainian. Have any studies been done in that regard about dance and the sense of belonging, people and place?
There have been some studies. I'm thinking right now, Sylvia Shaw wrote her PhD at the University of Calgary studying motivations of Ukrainian dancers and found that among many things, they were strongly motivated. The general population was totally not interested in politics, but super interested in culture. And she did her research in the 70s, which was Canada's slow version of the 60s. And I think that has changed quite a bit. I certainly agree with Ihor about the passion and the engagement and the identification that has been super strong. I know of some studies of Greek American, and lately one came out about Serbian Canadians, where the theoretical position of the author was these things, staged folk dancing of their ethnic community, makes them passionate Americans and passionate Serbians or Greeks or something like that. It makes them passionately by identifying, which is this rhizome thing happening, right? It's not a you can be Ukrainian or you can be a Canadian, but you can be both, and you can be a third thing and a fourth thing.
I would like to thank you, Dr. Andriy Nahachewsky, on behalf of two organizations that co-hosted this lecture, Kule Folklore Center and Alberta Society for the Advancement of Ukrainian Studies, and also for your attendance on Good Friday, that you came to listen to a really fascinating lecture. Dr. Andriy Nahachewsky, thank you.